So someone keeps requesting that I look at this video from Polydice, Why Inequality Matters. I'm only going to be reacting to a few parts of this because I've talked so much about wealth inequality, income inequality over the years, especially as of late. I did a recent rebuttal to Robespierre Reich, which you can check out on this issue. But this video, as you can see, has 29,000 views. This YouTuber has 32,000 subscribers. And from what I've seen, they have not been active in a couple years. But I do think there are a couple points worth addressing in this video. So let's check this out.
Whenever we talk about income and wealth inequality, many people on the right...
All right, now I already got to stop because he's mentioning both wealth inequality, income inequality. And I mentioned this in my recent rebuttal to Robespierre Reich about how wealth inequality and income inequality are not the same thing, but a lot of the inequality idiots often use them interchangeably. Just, when talking about it in general, they constantly switch between whether it's wealth inequality we should worry about or income inequality we should worry about. Keep that in mind.
Ask, why does it matter how much... Whenever we talk about income and wealth inequality, many people on the right ask, why does it matter how much inequality there is? Why does it matter how rich some people are? Shouldn't it only matter how poor they are? And wouldn't you much rather live in an unequal wealthy country than a country where everyone is equally poor? This is a common trope on the right, that inequality is connected to prosperity. Cavemen were equally poor, the people in low-income countries are equally poor, so all of this income inequality is just a part of living in a prosperous, high-income country.
All right, so I can kind of see where he's coming from here, but I also see where inequality critics are coming from because, yeah, a lot of the people that complain about wealth inequality, income inequality, they're hyper-focused on inequality. When you look at, countries like America, other market economies, where the standard of living has risen for the last 200 years and continues to rise due to innovation, productivity, all that good stuff. And so I think a lot of free market-leaning people who criticize all of these inequality talking points is like, yeah, there's a lot of wealth inequality, but shouldn't we be focusing? Because if the focus is on poverty and getting people out of poverty, shouldn't we be focusing on policies, solutions, find what system is best for people to escape poverty, rise out of poverty? I think that's the sentiment they come from. But I can also understand what he's about to get into, that wealth inequality is not always an indicator of progress.
There's nothing to support this.
See?
If we look at countries based on their Genie coefficient...
Now, he's using the Genie coefficient. Also keep that in mind.
We see there's no positive correlation between wealth and inequality. If anything, it seems to be the opposite, with high-income social democracies having a much more equal income distribution than the U.S.
See, yeah, that's what he likes. He likes all these green countries in Europe, especially the dark green countries.
Opposite, with high-income social democracy.
Now, you notice the qualifier he adds there, high income. That's what he wants to champion, because there's a lot of dark green countries like India, Ethiopia, I think that's Egypt. A lot of countries that, they have more income, they have more equal distributions of wealth, but probably not doing so well prosperity-wise.
Countries having a much more equal income distribution than the U.S. America's income inequality is much more in line with Russia, China, Venezuela, and Mexico than...
Yeah, and there's something to be said about that. That, yeah, some of these countries like Russia, like Mexico, Venezuela, China, yeah, they probably have a lot of wealth or income inequality. But is that what we should be focusing on? Because I think a big reason why these countries probably have a lot of inequality, it's not really the inequality that's the problem. It's the oppressive system that's the problem. It's the regime that's the problem that makes it difficult, if not impossible, for people to rise out of poverty and create wealth. But to Polydice, I guess the focus is wealth inequality. Woo! Or income inequality. See, now I'm getting all mixed up. See, this graph is of income inequality. You got to wonder, Something else that I've been talking about lately is the fact that a lot of people are very selective with how they present data. They are very selective in how they cherry pick data. He's using the Genie index on income inequality. Why not use the index on something like wealth inequality? Because after all, if we were to use wealth inequality, I guess according to the Genie index on wealth inequality, I guess countries like Sweden that are nice and dark green in this chart that he presents, Sweden is actually ahead of the United States on wealth inequality. And, their neighbors, Denmark, not far behind. And Sweden, they're closer to Russia than the United States in wealth inequality. So why aren't we using that chart to have this narrative? Anyway.
America's income inequality is much more in line with Russia, China, Venezuela, and Mexico than it is with Germany.
But I think the point he's making here is, again, that he's saying that people on the right will say, oh, income inequality is a sign of progress. I would say that it's a likely consequence of living in a freer society. And there's a huge difference in a place like Russia or Venezuela, where a ruling regime probably has a lot of income, a lot of wealth, where a great majority of the population lives in poverty. There's a big difference between that and someone in the United States like a Steve Jobs, a Jeff Bezos, a Bill Gates, creating billions of dollars worth of wealth, and like a company like Microsoft owning a lot of stake in that company, and that's how you're wealthy.
Norway, and Japan. In line with Russia, China, Venezuela, and Mexico than it is with Germany, Norway, and Japan.
So he mentions Germany, Norway, and Japan, all dark green. I guess those are countries that he likes, that he thinks America should emulate.
So the idea that we have to choose between a very unequal wealthy country and a more equal poor country is ridiculous. So why exactly is economic inequality a problem?
Why is economic inequality a problem?
It's inefficient from a utilitarian standpoint.
It's inefficient from a utilitarian standpoint. And my question to that is, who the hell cares? Because I don't know about you guys, but I am not a utilitarian. What is utilitarianism? According to Leonard Peikoff's book, The Ominous Parallels, utilitarianism is a union of hedonism and Christianity. The first teaches man to love pleasure, the second to love his neighbor. The union consists of teaching man to love his neighbor's pleasure. To be exact, the utilitarians teach that an action is moral if its result is to maximize pleasure among men in general. This theory holds that man's duty is to serve according to a purely quantitative standard of value. He is to serve not the well-being of the nation or of the economic class, but the greatest happiness of the greatest number, regardless of who comprise it in any given issue. As to one's own happiness, says Mill, the individual must be disinterested and strictly impartial. He must remember that he is only one unit out of dozens or millions of men affected by his actions. Quote, all honor to those who can abnegate for themselves the personal enjoyment of life, Mill says, when by such renunciation they contribute worthily to increase the amount of happiness in the world, unquote. Capitalism, Mill acknowledges, is not based on any desire for abnegation or renunciation. It is based on the desire for selfish profit. Nevertheless, he says the capitalist system ensures that most of the time the actual result of individual profit-seeking is the happiness of society as a whole. Hence, the individual should be left free of government regulation. He should be left free not as an absolute. There are no absolutes, says Mill. Under the present circumstances, not on the ground of inalienable rights, there are no such rights, Mill holds, but of social utility. Going on to say that it did not take Mill long to grasp the contradiction in some terms and amend his political views accordingly. I guess John Stuart Mill ended his life as a self-proclaimed qualified socialist.
No surprise there.
And from looking into this, I've seen definitions on Google, Wikipedia, Merriam-Webster that echo this definition, this sentiment about utilitarianism. That's what's moral is an action taken in the maximization of happiness amongst the greatest number of people or whatever. I am not a utilitarian. I am a radical for individual rights, freedom, and capitalism. In a free society, you are free to pursue your own happiness, but you are not guaranteed happiness. In fact, a local Detroit radio show host, Mike Valenti, actually echoed this sentiment recently. Check this out.
Other tenant in life, you're entitled to nothing. That's what you're entitled to in this world. Nothing. Oh, sure, you're entitled to the pursuit of happiness. You're not entitled to happiness. You're not entitled to wealth. You're not entitled to a great life. You're entitled for the chance to work for it.
Yes, you're entitled to a chance to work for it, a chance to pursue happiness. That doesn't mean that anyone owes you any means of achieving that happiness, just that you are free to pursue it. And on utilitarian grounds, in a utilitarian utopia, no one's really free if your actions, if your freedom, if your property, if your money are at the whims of some majority who can do whatever they want if they can justify it by, hey, we're just maximizing the happiness for the greatest amount of people. And Polydice kind of admits to this.
There's a concept in economics called diminishing marginal utility.
Who the hell cares?
And that essentially means that the more of something you have, the less you benefit from having more of it. So if a CEO went from making $53 million a year to making $52 million a year, what difference does it make? They
Makes $1 million difference.
still make $52 million that year. But if you take that $1 million difference,
If you take it,
and split it between 20 low-income families, $50,000 each, then that could change their lives.
see, you guys, if we, the guy who has $53 million, he's not going to lose much sleep. I mean, does anybody really need $53 million? But if you take that $1 million, they'll be fine. I mean, it's 52, that's a lot of money. But if you take that $1 million and you give it to 20 low-income families, that can make a huge difference. And he's probably right. I'd say he's definitely right. But then again, we got to ask, does that make it right? To just take someone else's money and give it to people based on need, based on the fact that you might be maximizing the happiness of 20 people versus the one person? I would say, someone I follow on Twitter, one of my mutuals, Coleman Milkarian, he actually made a good point about this a few weeks ago. Said this is your reminder that arguing for billionaires' rights is arguing for your own rights. And he did this in response to Janet Yellen. I know I talked about this on a recent video. But yeah, Janet Yellen wants to make it so that banks are required to report accounts, transactions over $600, and she justifies it like, oh, we're just really going to go after the billionaires. We really need to monitor $600 transaction and bank accounts so we can go after billionaires. When we all know that if this were ever to pass, that a lot of non-billionaires, a lot of non-millionaires are probably going to get a lot of friendly letters from the IRS in the mail. I mean, couldn't you even apply this to speech controls? Couldn't you say, well, insulting people, making fun of people, that might destroy their happiness? So why don't we have speech controls? Why don't we amend the First Amendment to say that society we can control speech if we're doing it in the aim of maximizing happiness? So I ask again, are you truly free in a utilitarian utopia if your money, your property, and your rights are at the mercy of people who think that they can just take it from you in the name of maximizing happiness.
This is why high-income countries with a more equal distribution of wealth than the US are happier, healthier, and have less crime. Because more resources are going to the people who need them instead of being hoarded by people who have more than they could ever need.
You guys get all that?
Each, and that could change their lives. This is why high-income countries with a more equal
distribution of income,
distribution of wealth in the
I guess,
US are happier, healthier, and have less crime.
They're happier, healthier, and have less crime.
Because more resources are going to the people who need them instead of being hoarded by people who have more than they could ever need.
Because more people have access to resources because they're not being hoarded. Anyway. So he's using the Legatum Prosperity Index to really drive this point home. Now go back to when he brought up this map, all of these wonderful green countries with their more equal distributions of income like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Japan. He specifically mentions Norway, Germany, and Japan. And now he's using this prosperity index to show, see, these countries with a more equal distribution of wealth, they're happier, they're healthier, they have less crime. I guess they're ahead of the United States on this wonderful prosperity index. He mentions Japan. Let's hear that again.
Germany, Norway, and Japan. In line with Russia, China, Venezuela, and Mexico than is with Germany, Norway, and Japan.
I guess those are some of the better countries. So let's take a look at this prosperity index. It's right here. I downloaded it. You can find it just by looking it up. Isn't it convenient? You go back to the video. Isn't it convenient that he, when he presents this chart, he cuts it off at the bottom, at United States. United States at 17, and that's where he cuts off the map, or the chart. But if you look at the chart, you notice that Japan is ranked below the United States.
Whoopsie daisy!
Here it is right here. I thought Japan was better than the United States because they have a more equal distribution of wealth and income. Go back to the chart, go back to the map, and you see like you got all those green countries in Europe, high income, green, equal distribution of income like France, Italy, Spain. Then bring this chart back up, and all of these countries seem to be behind the United States on this wonderful prosperity index. And he talks about health. He says, oh, these countries, they're healthier than the United States. And I've talked about this in recent videos because I hear this a lot from people on the left about how, oh, the United States, you think it's so wonderful, but look where they rank on all these healthy life expectancy indexes. And when I looked into it, it's like, oh, this is largely a result not of capitalism or free markets, but of people making life decisions. Like they eat too much, they get obese, they become overweight, they consume a lot of alcohol, they consume a lot of tobacco. But right here, the United States, this is one of the categories that brings down the United States on this prosperity index. And Polydice thinks that America's health problems are a consequence of what? The fact that we don't tax the top 1% enough, as if we raise taxes in an attempt to reduce income inequality, that all of these health problems in America would magically go away.
That's just not smart.
Going back to economic quality, because he mentions that that people are getting the resources that they really need.
They could ever need. Resources are going to the people who need them instead of being hoarded by people who have more than they could ever need.
Yeah, that's what's going on here. But yet, if you look at this prosperity index, economic quality, it's the pillar that ranks countries on the standard of living afforded by an economy. And you notice that the United States, while they rank 17, they rank 13 in economic quality ahead of countries like the UK, like Canada, like Australia on economic quality. And then he also mentions that they have less crime, yet if you look at countries like Singapore and Hong Kong, which are some of the leaders in safety and security on this prosperity index, meanwhile, I think Hong Kong more especially, this was 2018, so before communist China got further entrenched in Hong Kong, But Hong Kong redistributed less wealth in a lot of these countries that are toward the top. So I'm not sure if that even applies. But Polydice also mentions that these countries are a lot happier. And I don't think this index really talks much about happiness, but this talking point often comes from this World Happiness Report. And usually when it comes out, you can see right here, usually countries like Finland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, they usually rank in the top 10, all of those countries. They usually clean house. And then you see all these left-wing pages like the other 98% and Occupy Democrats. They say, oh, you know why these countries, you know why they're so happy? You know why they rank so high on the happiness index? It's because of socialism. It's because of their generous welfare state. It's because of all these government intervention wealth redistribution programs, right? But now Polydice is saying that, oh, these countries are happier because they have a more equal distribution of wealth. And again, this kind of falls apart on paper when you consider that one of the countries that has a more equal distribution of wealth, like Japan, ranks below the United States on the World Happiness Index, as does, again, France, Italy, Spain. And Michael Booth talks about this point in his book, The Almost Nearly Perfect People. He spends, he talks about each of the Scandinavian countries, and when he talks about Denmark, he actually talks about both the Genie coefficient and the happiness delusion, as you can see. Talks about how this is mostly a cultural issue, saying that in Denmark, quoting Ad Knudsen, saying, in Denmark, it is shameful to be unhappy. If you ask me how I am and I start telling you how bad I feel, then it might force you to do something about it. It might put a burden on you to help me. So that's one of the main reasons people say things are all right or even super. Quoting another Danish friend of his, Booth says, we always come up top of those surveys because they ask us at the beginning of the year what our expectations are. Then they ask us at the end of the year if those expectations were met, and because our expectations are so extremely low at the beginning of the year, they tend to get met more easily. Anyway, I think that Polydice is being a little oversimplistic with his analysis. But also this prosperity index mentions about how a country like Estonia has made a lot of progress. They've risen out of poverty, largely due to reforming their tax system, and that where they have some of the lowest tax rates in the world and have become more competitive as a result. They also credit this to deregulation for the prosperity of Estonia. So you got to wonder, I got to wonder, do you think someone like a Polydice is going to recommend that we lower taxes and deregulate in the name of prosperity?
Number 2, pricing out.
Pricing out.
Making $30,000 a year in Mississippi is not the same as making $30,000 a year in New York or California. There are several reasons for this, but one of them is that the majority, or at least a plurality, of rich Americans live in New York or California.
You hear that?
They have the most money to spend, so supply and demand takes its course and things become too expensive for low-income people to live there. This is how gentrification works.
It's gentrification's fault, you guys.
You can make a decent living in a low-income area, but if a company brings in a lot of high-income people, then the cost of rent goes up, the cost of food goes up, and less privileged people are forced into even worse areas.
Said the cost of food and housing goes up?
Decent living in a low-income area, but if a company brings in a lot of high-income people, then the cost of rent goes up, the cost of food goes up.
Oh, cost of rent.
And less privileged people are forced into even worse areas or even homelessness.
This is what surging homeless
people are forced into.
So notice what he's doing here. He's bringing up examples like New York and California where it's become increasingly expensive to live, and he blames it on supply and demand. He's not entirely wrong, but he ultimately blames it on inequality, on rich people, gentrification coming into these states and driving up costs because of supply and demand. And if you've been paying attention to some of the videos I've put out over the last few months, one of those videos back in August was all about why housing in California is so expensive. It's a 40-minute video, but I go into great detail about how a big reason why housing in California is through the roof is because of government intervention in that area, which started in 1972 when then Governor Ronald Reagan signed the California Environmental Quality Act, which has since been used as a club by NIMBYs, construction unions, environmentalist groups, and other pressure groups to shake down developers or stop developments from being built altogether. And as a consequence, the supply of housing in California has not nearly kept up with the pace of population growth. And this was before I read Thomas Sowell's book, Economic Facts and Fallacies, where he talks about how government intervention in housing ended up causing housing costs to skyrocket, saying in 1901, housing costs took 23% of the average American's family spending. By 2003, it took 33%. In California, where government interventions in housing markets have been especially pervasive, the proportion of income required for housing has increased even more steeply in an even shorter span of time, saying that most people know that San Francisco Bay Area has one of the most expensive housing markets in the nation. However, not everyone realizes that as recently as 1970, Bay Area housing was as affordable as housing in many other parts of the country. Data from 1970 census shows that a median income Bay Area family could dedicate a quarter of their income to housing and pay off their mortgage on a median priced home in just 13 years. By 1980, a family had to spend 40% of their income to pay off their mortgage in 30 years. Today, it requires 50%. Gee, I wonder what the fuck happened in the early 1970s that led to this. But remember, guys, it's all gentrification and income inequality's fault. He even mentions how this also happened. Polly Dice brings up New York State as an example. And Thomas Sowell talks about New York City, a similar pattern showing housing prices affected more by building restrictions than increased demands for housing was found in New York City, where tens of thousands of new units were built in Manhattan in the 1950s, while prices remained flat. In later years, especially after severe building restrictions began in the 1970s, all that changed. In spite of skyrocketing prices, the housing stock has grown by less than 10% since 1980 in Manhattan, according to an article in an economic journal 25 years later. Moreover, the proportion of new housing units in buildings 20 stories tall and higher, which had been increasing in Manhattan from the beginning of the 20th century until 1970, suddenly reversed and began a decades-long decline.
Really makes you think.
On the other hand, Thomas Sowell also mentions how other areas like Houston and Las Vegas did not have this problem. Mentions how Houston, Texas, for example, does not even have zoning laws, much less the array of severe housing restrictions found in some other cities. A nationwide real estate firm estimated that a typical middle-class home on a quarter-acre lot that costs $152,000 in Houston would cost more than $300,000 in Portland, Oregon, $900,000 in Long Beach, California, and more than $1 million in San Francisco. Oh no, you guys, it's all gentrification's fault. Also talks about how Las Vegas, the population of Las Vegas almost tripled between 1980 and 2000, but the real median housing price did not change that, largely as a result of the fact that Las Vegas does not have the same building restrictions as places like California and New York. So again, Polydice is not entirely wrong to mention supply and demand. Where he's wrong is to blame it on wealth inequality and income inequality rather than government intervention in housing. You guys think someone like a Polydice is going to demand that there be less government intervention in housing? All right, I'm going to skip ahead and end on this because this is another point that the person who requested this video wanted me to address.
Fringe opinion. When we talk about the outrageous amount of income and wealth inequality, we're talking about the sheer scale of it and how real wages have largely stagnated for most Americans.
Another video I recently did a video on called The 1970s Were the Golden Era in America, where I go into detail on the wage stagnation myth.
While the wealthy keep getting wealthier. CEOs have gone from making 20 times as much as their average worker to making 361 times as much as their average worker.
Cool.
There is such a huge gap between everyone should make the exact same amount of money and, hey, maybe we shouldn't have a system that produces inequality comparable to Russia and Venezuela.
Why is that the standard, though? Shouldn't I think the standard should be whether or not we're freer than countries like Russia and Venezuela, which I think we are, and I think wealth inequality is a non-essential. But going back to this point about how I guess CEOs back in the 1950s, they made 20 times the salary as the average worker, and now it's even increased. I would say that the decisions on who businesses want to hire and how much they're paid, that is solely between the owners of the business, i.e. the shareholders, and the people that these businesses are going to hire. How much a corporate executive is compensated is between the shareholders and the executive. Like, what is this crap about, like, the night? This isn't the first time I've heard it. Like, the 50s, we had this 20 to 1 ratio between executive pay and worker pay. Who decided this was the magical ratio? Like, is this how Polydice thinks that businesses should operate and hire executives? Just add up all of the salaries of the rank and file workers, divide it up, find the average, and then multiply that by 20, and poof, you have your CEO's salary ceiling. Is this a good way to find a good CEO? I guess maybe this might be a good way to determine executive pay in a utilitarian fantasy land where you don't have to think about things like competition, stock options, and all that fun stuff. The fact that good executives, good CEOs can be very difficult to find. And one way businesses compete for such talent is by trying to offer more money. And I guess I will end by saying that I would rather live in a freer world where corporate executives may sometimes make 1,000 times the amount of money as their secretary or whatever, than live in a world where wannabe philosopher kings and economic planners think that they can resort to coercion after deciding how much stuff and happiness that everyone really needs.